English humour, a swoop and a soar through the upper reaches of English language humour. Part 6, from variety to television. This is supposedly a history of English humour, so let's have a little bit of history. This is a kind of bridge between what we've seen up to now and what is to come, because we're going to look at the state of live comedy just as the transition was being made to televised comedy. Well, we've seen the English tradition was the typical London music hall, so obviously the earliest TV performers would come from that background. It's a background we'll go back to in some detail later, but the story of this pair of well-loved comedians happens to span the time frame that we're looking at. Eric, Morecambe and Ernie Wise, who we came to know as Eric and Ernie, as well as Morecambe and Wise, met at Jack Hilton's revue Youth Takes a Bow at the Nottingham Empire. It was Eric's mother, Sadie, who said, "Why don't you form a double act?" And they did, debuting at the Liverpool Empire in 1941. Now, the next part in Wiki says they made their name in Variety. So what is Variety? Well, Variety was the descendant of the music hall. Often they would tour the country, taking in places such as the Windmill Theatre in London and the Glasgow Empire, of which more later. So they would take the typical route into radio and then to television. 1954, their debut TV show led to the famous criticism, "TV set, the box in which they buried Morecambe and Wise." A cutting which Eric Morecambe carried around with him wherever he went. They got a few more TV breaks, and even a couple of films, but they're most famous for their TV shows, which kind of translated the variety format to television within a framework of comedy. It's interesting to note that Hills and Green, the first scriptwriters, earned more money than Morecambe and Wise. Of course, in music hall, you could, in theory, live as the vaudeville comedians and musicians did in America, with basically the same show, which with a few changes and add-ons could last you 40 years. But of course, television brought us immediacy. Once you've been on the television, everyone's seen it, you can't use the joke again. That's why Eric and Ernie's scriptwriters were of crucial importance. Eddie Braben was perhaps Eric and Ernie's most famous scriptwriter, and again, interesting to note that Eddie took on board almost all the writing, as Spike Milligan did with The Goons, as we'll see later. A far cry from today, when shows such as Friends or The Simpsons or any of their follow-ups employ hordes of scriptwriters. Now, Morecambe and Wise were a double act, which in itself was not standard. In fact, if you see them today, it will surprise you to learn that the original straight man was Eric Morecambe, while Ernie Wise was in charge of delivering the punchlines. Well, that got swapped around to excellent effect, and off they went. Eric Morecambe with his comic mannerisms and his excellent delivery, and both of them with a superb sense of timing, which, if you'd like to check it out, the Grieg Piano Concerto sketch is still available on the internet and is always worth an educational watch. These specially written sketches, combined with old-style music hall type jokes, became a huge success. They also had a running gag, which was, "It's nice out, isn't it?" They'd tell this often without getting to the punchline. The punchline, as revealed later, was, "Yes, but you'd better put it back, the deck chair attendant is coming." And from these beginnings, Morecambe and Wise became perhaps the most popular double act that England has ever seen. Immensely popular, drawing huge audiences for their Christmas Day TV special, which got 25 million or possibly more, maybe 28 million, it's estimated, viewers on Christmas Day 1977. And their career was not atypical. Eric Morecambe was one of a handful of comedians who died on stage in front of a live audience. Eric's last words were, "I'm glad that's over." Sid James, who we've seen in connection with the Carry On films, also died on stage, aged 63, at the Sunderland Empire. And also performer Kenneth Horne, the star of Round the Horne, which we'll look at soon. He died of a heart attack just after receiving an award. Again, out of the remit of this book, but in 1904 in Poland, the comic actor Emil Hazda took 6 curtain calls before shooting himself in the head in front of the audience, possibly due to a rejected marriage proposal. Tommy's demise, by the way, was actually on television, and when people realised, when they stopped laughing, this happened to all of them, people would think it was part of the act. Happened to Ian Cognito, an alternative comedian that I saw many times. He died in Bicester, not long after having done a routine about having a heart attack. He sat on a chair and laid back for 5 minutes. People, of course, thought this was part of the routine. Let's bring this macabre list to an end with Leonard Rossiter. He died of a heart attack in his dressing room while preparing to go on stage to perform in Joe Orton's play Loot, which will also crop up again later. So the rest of this segment could be a list of successful TV performers, especially in the early days, the ones that transitioned from musical to variety to television. We look at Sunday Night at the Palladium, a very popular show in its day. This was pretty much an attempt to recreate a typical variety night. Chelsea-hating Tommy Trinder was the original host, and he was definitely of the music hall tradition. But from there, via shows a little bit more like the Morecambe and Wise show, these entertainments morphed into new formats, maybe sketch comedy, maybe sitcoms, and certainly with more of an eye on the television than on the live audience. This is an Anglo-centric book, but I'm sure Americans would recognise something similar with Lucille Ball's story. I Love Lucy became the most popular American show of its day. In fact, one Christmas episode attracted 8 million viewers on CBS, which you may think isn't very much, but this was a colourised version of the episode put out on Christmas Day 62 years previously. And it's the way the show was done that makes this important. It was scripted, shot on 35mm film in front of a studio audience, and then edited. So we've got a live audience, but an edited final product. It's also supposed to be the first show with an ensemble cast in which the same characters would appear again and again. And as the years went on, Lucille's desperate need to make it in showbiz, which was the premise of the series, leads her into many a situation where she can clown and show off the skills that she really had. Another thing about this early TV sitcom is that, as we've seen, it didn't use canned laughter. But it also didn't go into backstories and story arcs, which are all the rage in 2020's programme planning. Very soon, the British technicians had learned from these American techniques, for example, shooting with various cameras and changing shot, or in a dialogue, filming the person that isn't speaking so that you can get the so-called reaction shots, or even the occasional mugging. And by mugging here, I mean playing to the camera, as if the camera was an extra person. Some have claimed that the original mugger was Oliver Hardy, of the famous early cinema duo Laurel and Hardy. After one of Stan Laurel's clumsinesses, he would often look at the camera as if inviting us to sympathise with his situation, having to deal with this idiot. There'll be plenty of time to look at what happened between the 50s and the 80s in this series, as we'll see. But for now, let's just stop at 1984 when Channel 4 began. This was the 4th national television station, and it made its mark because it got behind the new type of comedy that was emerging in the 80s. It was called alternative comedy at the time, and again, much more about this later. And suddenly we began to see comedians who didn't rely on mother-in-law jokes or obvious stereotypes. We will fill in the gaps later when we talk about nonsense and surrealism, as the precedents here included shows like Spike Milligan's Q or Monty Python, That Was the Week That Was, Round the Horn, etc., which were mixtures of satire and absurdism. Now, there are two things that work against the comedian in television or any kind of recorded comedy. First, as we've noticed, you can't repeat your joke. Once you've done it and it's out there, it's out there. But there's another thing here. If you're on a national broadcaster, you may be subject to the censorship that the music hall performers found cunning ways to get around. The BBC issued a pamphlet to its scriptwriters in the 50s where there were a list of rules about what you couldn't say. You couldn't make openly sexual jokes, openly, but we've seen they did make sexual jokes, not openly. You couldn't laugh at the royal family. And at the end, Dennis Norden informs us there was a long list of punchlines you weren't allowed to use, most of which were known, but the intriguing "his mother was frightened by a donkey" remains as a punchline without a joke to it. Unless anybody knows it, please get in touch. So there's a kind of pearl-clutching attitude to the BBC in those days, and we're talking about Great Britain, which was, we like to think, a free country. And another inconvenience was this idea of having a live audience. As we've seen, it was quite common to record in front of a live audience. This was often seen at the end of the TV show. It would say, recorded in front of a live audience at blah, blah, blah. But of course, you don't get that immediacy that you do from being there, because the comedian does feed off the reactions of the public, consciously or not. But then in 1950, in the United States, an ingenious device was invented for the Hank McCune show. Yes, it was the first time we ever saw canned laughter. Here you simply dub the laughter onto the sketch where the laughter should occur. Canned laughter was easier and cheaper, but then also became a sign of a cheap product in the other sense. So that's a brief summary of what was happening while music hall was becoming variety, which was just around when televised performances began to be broadcast, and forms a little bridge in the history. And we'll be returning to look at how comedy shaped television later. But as is the case now, it was the case then that a lot of the television programmes were trialled on the radio. And as far as the British were concerned, this medium came very much to the fore during and after the Second World War, when the Forces Radio was set up to entertain the armed forces, wherever they might be in the world. Also, ENSA sent out they were called concert parties to entertain the troops, especially those that were far from home during this very worrying period. And because of the mass appeal of television and radio, this was a comedy that could reach everybody. You don't even have to buy a ticket to the music hall. You can just sit on your seat and take in what is offered. So in the next segment, we're going to look at this, the effect that the prevalence of radio had on spoken word comedy, and as we'll see, sound effects comedy.